Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Press Club's second webinar in our series on misinformation and disinformation. I'm Nick Richardson. I'm CEO of the Melbourne Press Club. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land. I'd also like to pay respect to their elders, both past and present of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present on this webinar. So this is our second in our three-part series on misinformation and disinformation. We'll be having a discussion today with our two guests for about 35 minutes, and then we'll go to your questions. Please put that Q&A in the Q&A section on our webinar, and we'll have some directions to that from the chat function. Now, to this really important issue, more than half of the world will be eligible to vote this year. And arguably, with so many national elections around the globe in 2024, there's never been a more important year for democracy. And already we've seen just how vulnerable elections are to misinformation and disinformation, including the emergence of notorious deepfakes. In South Korea, Indonesia, the Solomon Islands, in India, all these issues have become prevalent. And we should have no doubt that there will be issues in the current election campaign in the UK and in the US presidential race later this year. And closer to home, we have the Victorian Council elections in October that one of our guests will be doing his level best to ensure remain free from any of these issues. The prevalence of misinformation and disinformation represent a profound challenge to journalists who are trying to provide useful facts for the voting public. So what can we learn from this troubled environment to ensure journalists and voters have the tools required to support our democracies? And here to help us explore all of that are our two guests. The first is the Victorian Electoral Commissioner, Sven Blumel. Sven started his 10-year term as Commissioner last August, following his role as the inaugural Victorian Information Commissioner. He's trained as a lawyer. He's worked in senior roles in the West Australian Public Service and also in the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department in Canberra before coming to Victoria. Welcome to the webinar, Sven, and thanks for your participation. Our second guest is Dr. Michael Jensen, Associate Professor at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. Michael's background is in political communication, and he's published books with Cambridge University Press and Palgrave about online political behaviour. Thanks for joining us, Michael. So let's get this underway with the same broad question to both of you, and I'll invite you each to reflect on it from your own perspectives. Disinformation is now the single biggest threat to electoral integrity. Sven, how true do you think this statement is? Are we at that stage, or do we still have some way to go?
I'm careful not to say we're there, because one of the things I'm always worried about is that things can always get harder. If the question were, is disinformation a major threat to electoral integrity, I'd have no hesitation at saying yes, true, no question. The hesitation is simply because I don't want to be in the position where in a couple of years hence we look back and things have gotten even more complex, which tends to be the general arc of history in this space. And we didn't foresee that. So it's a huge issue for us. There's no question about that. It exercises our minds as an electoral management body here in Victoria, as it does my colleagues around the world for that matter, enormously. It is a huge issue. And for us, part of the frustration is that the actual integrity of the election or elections in Victoria that we undertake will stand up to any level of fair scrutiny. I'm entirely confident of that, and anyone who's been any part of observing how we run elections in Victoria, I believe, would share the same view. And that's why mis and disinformation is so pernicious. because, of course, however good we are at doing it does not prevent the mis and disinformation from arising. So it's a long-winded way of saying probably. It is definitely one of the biggest challenges. Is it the single biggest challenge? Hard to say. It may well be. Is this as bad as it's going to get? Experience tells me I should not answer that.
Michael, from your perspective, is disinformation the biggest single threat to democracy?
Well, I want to start off by saying I think a lot of what Sven has said, certainly good counsel in thinking about this. I mean, whatever we think is the biggest threat today, adversaries and anyone who is up to electoral shenanigans will come up with some way to innovate on it and do something we haven't thought of yet. But to kind of set things into a broader context, if we're thinking about electoral integrity, there are a few aspects to that we might want to consider. On the one hand, there's the mechanics of the vote counting and the allocation of seats based on the votes that are given. And you can have manipulation there happening as a result, not of disinformation per se, or at least not in a technical sense, but in a more of as a result of, say, a cyber attack that can manipulate those results. And there have been cases around the world where malign foreign actors have attempted to interfere with the vote counting process using cyber means. But writ large, campaigns are a communication event. There are an interaction via communications that happen through a variety of different media between candidates and political parties and members of the voting public. And as a result, if manipulation is going to happen there, it may take the form of disinformation, but we should also not fixate entirely on the idea of disinformation limited only to stating things that are demonstrably false, because a lot of manipulation comes in the form of people saying things that are true or partly true or true from a particular perspective, but often taken out of context or placed in a completely different context. So, for example, in the United States today, there's a big controversy. In fact, there was a court filing about it in an effort to get a injunction against Donald Trump because he alleged that the FBI had orders to use lethal force during their search of his property in Florida. And it is true that they did, but the way he spun that was they were out there, therefore, to assassinate him, which is completely taken out of context because that was boilerplate language that under certain circumstances, FBI officials are allowed to use lethal force when executing a search on a private property. And in fact, those same instructions were included on the warrant that was used to search the properties of Joe Biden as well in a similar time frame. So there's a lot of distortion going on there. But it is true, those FBI officers were authorized to use lethal force under certain circumstances during the execution of that search. But it's very misleading. And these kinds of statements you find in a variety of contexts. Several years ago, we had a campaign where there was a claim that Labor was planning to bring back a death tax. Well, the specific text of those statements were, well, Labor is planning to tax superannuation more. They're planning to tax via negative gearing changes. Is it inconceivable that they're planning to go and tax inheritance or create what is commonly known as a death tax? It's not inconceivable. But are they planning to do that? Probably not. But it's those kinds of manipulations that can be, in one sense, trivially true, in another sense, deceptive. That's the bread and butter of a lot of campaigns. And that's from domestic actors as well as from foreign actors. And then it's just a question of how creative they get in doing those things.
So I'm grateful to you, Michael, because you've taken me to where I wanted to go with the next question to Sven, because Sven, in some submissions that the VEC has made, you've kind of made it clear that in an electoral context, misinformation and disinformation pose the same level of threat to the integrity of the democratic processes as each other. Michael's given us a bit of a window on examples of that. Why does the VEC think they're both as potentially impactful as the other.
Yeah, and what we mean by that, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, which I'm sure we are, is that both mis and disinformation is incorrect information that can mislead people. Misinformation is not necessarily intentionally false. Disinformation is intentionally false. So that it's in that context that we've made those submissions. For us, the effect of both can be equally bad. As an example, say during the most acute phase of the COVID pandemic, mis and disinformation about whether you have to be vaccinated in order to vote. Now, that was never the case. You never had to be vaccinated to vote. Anyone could vote. But the incorrect information about not being able to vote if you are unvaccinated, whether that was forwarded on or even created with someone believing it to be true or by someone wanting to mislead, the ultimate effect might be that people who were not vaccinated did not or would not come out to vote. And that would be a really harmful thing to democracy if people were deprived of their right to vote and to be able to exercise it freely and fairly. And so therefore, whether almost certainly anyone who created that piece of incorrect information in the first instance was almost certainly guilty of disinformation, because it was almost certainly created to deliberately mislead. But along that whole chain, where that got from an individual who first wrote it to the hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people who may have heard about it or even seen it, there were certainly parts in that transmission chain that believed it and passed it on. And they were then not guilty of disinformation because they were not intending to mislead. They thought, oh my God, my family needs to know about this. I better send it on to all my friends and family and they better look at it. The effect is ultimately harmful. So that's why we've made it clear that while it's often useful to distinguish between mis and disinformation because of how we can combat it, the ultimate result and the ultimate negative impact on our democracy from both can be really pernicious.
And Michael, how did these play out in the Solomon Islands election, which of course had significant strategic significance for Australia in terms of the result of that election?
Well, the Solomon Islands election result was interesting, both in terms of some of the manipulative communications that occurred during the campaign and the last week or so of the campaign, as well as the large division between what happened in terms of the electoral results and what happened in terms of government formation. In terms of some of the disinformation that was put out during the election campaign, there was a piece that appeared in Sputnik, Russian state propaganda outlet, 8 days before Election Day, which included large quotes from a letter that was going around in certain areas in the Solomon Islands, alleging that the United States government, through its Agency for International Development and some of its election support and civil society support operations, was intending to effectively foment a coup in the Solomon Islands to ensure the election of U.S.-friendly candidates. It's interesting that despite getting only about a quarter of the vote, and a little more than a quarter of the total seats in the parliament, the party that was the former Prime Minister Sogavari's political party nonetheless managed to cobble together a government, again, with more or less the same people in slightly different positions. And they were able to defeat Daniel Suudani from Malaita from being able to become the premier of Malaita yet again. And there are allegations that a lot of bribery was going on in terms of promises to provide development projects to various wards and so forth as a result of that. So certainly, if a coup was the ambition of the United States, they certainly didn't deliver, because the resulting government was one that I'm sure the Chinese government is pretty happy with. Having said that, it was interesting that this piece from Sputnik appeared for two reasons. The first is it was later picked up by the Global Times, which is tabloid associated with the People's Daily in China on election day, and then another story on it 2 days after election day. It's kind of beggars belief, though, the idea that somehow Sputnik would have had better sourcing than Chinese outlets would have in the Solomon Islands, especially since the Chinese government has helped arrange for partnerships between Chinese newspapers and newspaper and other media outlets in the Solomon Islands. There's been reporting that the Solomon Stars received financial assistance directly from entities in China as well, and that may have had some impacts on their editorial policy and whatnot. So, that's really remarkable. And the implication of that is that if somehow the Chinese got that first, if they then passed it off to a Russian source, that would suggest that there's coordination going on between Russia and China with respect to influence operations in one of our closest Pacific neighbors. And this is an article that did appear in a handful of groups that are domestic, public groups in the Solomon Islands, like teachers groups and other groups linked to various constituencies where they talk about politics and so forth. And they're getting engagement on this post as well. So it's something to be concerned about if that's an indication that there is coordination going on between Russia and China to achieve their like-minded strategic ambitions in the Pacific region.
So I'm interested in the early remarks you made there about effectively there wasn't a change in the flavour of the government there, despite what was going on. Are we, and this is going to be a question for you both, are we overestimating the impact disinformation and misinformation has in terms of electoral results? There might well be engagement, as you've identified, Michael, but is it actually translating into a significant shift in the way that electorates are voting? Do we know at this stage?
Well, I'm happy to sort of take the start of that, which is that it's always worth bearing in mind what is intended to be achieved with mis and disinformation, because in an electoral context, it may not even be a particular electoral result that's being sought to be achieved with mis and disinformation. It might be sowing general doubt on the integrity of the process or on public institutions generally to foment disagreement, to polarize the community. For some actors, that may be their result more so than I want candidate A or B to win. So I think that's an important one to bear in mind. That's something I'd throw into that conversation.
Michael?
I'd say sometimes it's the case that they want one government to win or they want a particular electoral result. There was reporting in Canada that the Chinese sought to produce a minority government in Canada, one that would be relatively weak in its ability to pursue policies that would be contrary to the CCP's interests. And that indeed was the government that they got. It's less clear. It's much harder to establish a causal linkage between a specific influence operation and the movement of votes one way or another. But I put a couple of caveats in terms of trying to think about that relationship. Historically, these operations in the Russian context were called active measures, and there's a scholar named Thomas Rid who describes active measures in a digital era are more active and less measured, in part because online we have a lot of information cascades that happen where things get turned around in various ways that are hard to predict. Some things go viral, some things disappear very quickly. And it's hard to know exactly how something's going to be reappropriated. I mean, lots of fast food restaurants and other companies have tried various hashtag campaigns and found those hashtags very quickly got hijacked. And things that were rather unpredictable were the result. But I think Sven's right that we need to think about it beyond just trying to determine an electoral result, or even, as a mass population campaign. A lot of times they'll just try to mobilize certain constituencies to move a set of voters from a inactive status to a active. I'm going to definitely vote, and I'm going to vote in a particular way, maybe for a marginal or third party. Or they might try to move people into a non-voting category. This was part of the Black Lives Matter campaign that was waged by Russia's Internet Research Agency in 2016. There's some indications in the United States that this may also be part of the strategy to demobilize Arab Americans in 2024 by saying Biden and Donald Trump are both terrible for the Palestinian people, so you can't in good conscience vote for anybody, stay out of this particular election. And that may be another move, but they could also just be trying to erode trust in the system, increase polarization, which increases the frictions and the costs of governance and weakens country internally, preventing it from being able to unify its people and pursue common goals, particularly on an international stage.
And Nick, for us as an electoral management body, the costs of mis and disinformation about the sort of things that we've been talking about here also makes our job, well, sure, harder, but also more expensive, because we have to then devote many more resources to identifying mis and disinformation, responding to it, making it clear to the community how we maintain our political independence and so on. Now, we do all of those things, but the more we have to do of that, the more effort and cost it takes to run the election and run the period in between elections, for that matter. And mis and disinformation adds to that. And one thing I've got to be just really clear about in that regard, as the VEC, of course, we're really only interested in this space in mis and disinformation about elections, electoral processes, electoral rights, how to exercise them correctly, and so on. Anything else beyond that about the sort of issues, and Michael's touched on some of those, about arguable mis and disinformation in policy platforms of candidates and so on, clearly for the VEC, that is not our space to play in. We are the independent umpire, and we independently run the election. So we have to draw a really bright line between those two things, and we always do, of course. But the spillover into how hard it is to run an election, to attract the casual workforce we need to run an election. I mean, a state election takes over 20,000 people in terms of a workforce. We need to attract them. Yes, we pay them, but we are reliant on them. And mis and disinformation in this sort of space has a cost to how well we can do that and at what cost.
So that's interesting, and I suppose the other element that is always attached to the Australian context is the importance of mandatory voting in this country as a means of quarantining us from some of the worst consequences of misinformation and disinformation. Sven, I can probably predict what your response to that view is, but I'd be interested in both of your perspectives, and Michael, yours perhaps from an international one. But firstly, Sven, is it true? Do you think that is as a powerful antidote as we like to comfort ourselves into thinking?
Yes, I think it is. And the other really crucial element that we have in Australia, in addition to the compulsory voting angle, is independent electoral management bodies like the VEC and others. Even in many other Western countries, the US being a very clear example, of course, the sort of role that I do is actually undertaken by a political appointee. Now, whereas here we are so careful at the VEC, like our counterparts around Australia, at ensuring that we are independent, apolitical, we verify that our staff are, all of those sorts of things, absolutely essential, because that is what has created the trust that we do still see. The community has very strong levels of trust in the VEC and its political independence and its ability to effectively run elections. And that's our stock in trade. We have to protect that. So in addition to the compulsory voting part, I'd also say independent and well overseen electoral commissions that are overseen by apolitical bodies like an electoral management committee and the like is absolutely crucial to that as well.
Michael, is it as important as Australia likes to think it is?
I think it is really important. I think Sven is spot on when talking about the role of both the compulsory voting requirements as well as the difference in having an independent electoral body to monitor elections. Now, there are a couple caveats I'd put on that. The first is we have seen declines even in Australia of people participating in elections despite the fact that voting is compulsory. So, I mean, certainly making it compulsory is better than not having it compulsory. In terms of independent electoral bodies, they're in this regard much better than partisan ones, where it looks like, one party or another that's in charge of running an election in a particular state or locality might be tipping the scales in favor of one party or the other, and that can lead to kind of pile-on effects in terms of loss of legitimacy. But at the same time, the Victorian Electoral Commission, the Australian Electoral Commission, or any of the other electoral bodies around Australia still need to be concerned that their integrity can be attacked, particularly if they're taking positions that other people just don't want to accept. So thinking back to 2022, when there was a rumor going around some social media platforms that Australia was using Dominion voting machines in order to flip votes for one or other of the major parties. And that was something they had to address, rebutting in that narrow parameter. I think that's right, that they should stay within those narrow bounds of the administration elections, but to push back and say, no, this is not true. We don't use Dominion voting machines. At the same time, there are people who said, well, you're just lying. And they weren't accepting that. And it's a question, empirically, does that take off? And does a false story online corrode trust in the institutions of Australian government over time, even if they're apartisan? Now, I'd like to introduce a third issue I think that Australia has that is an advantage over some of the other Anglo democracies, which is the single transferable vote. When you vote, even if you vote for a minor party, there's a higher threshold for a minor party to actually capture that seat compared to, say, a plurality system, first past the post structure of elections, whereby you can have somebody who gets a minority of the vote still win just because the vote was split between so many other parties. And particularly in an era of where political marketing techniques are taking off, where a kind of there might be a plant of a candidate in a particular district to split the vote on one side or another of the ideological spectrum in order to aid your favored candidate in that particular contest. When you have those transfers of the votes from first to second and third preference and so forth, that tends to have an effect of moving those votes back to the center, which reduces the capacity for somebody to try to engineer outcome through various forms of manipulation, either by planting certain candidates or by targeting certain campaigns with information attack or various supports for a candidate to try to skew the result.
And Nick, if I may just add one little point to the compulsory voting issue. A quid pro quo that we take very seriously in Australia and certainly in Victoria for compulsory voting is that if the state is going to say to its people, you must vote, then the quid pro quo for that is that we as electoral commissions have to make that really easy and accessible. That's absolutely crucial. If we're saying you have to do it, well, then we've got to make it easy for you to do that. For us, that obviously includes making it very easy to vote in a way that suits you. You don't have to go back to, like you do in the UK, for example, to the particular electorate where you're registered, all of those sorts of things. But it also means that we need to continue doing a lot of outreach for communities that might otherwise have greater barriers to exercising their right to vote. people with disabilities, culturally and linguistically diverse Victorians, people who are remote and in regional areas, all of that. To me, that's the quid pro quo. And again, we take that very, very seriously.
In the last couple of years in particular, AI has become a very significant player in a whole range of activities and industries. It's also has become responsible in some instances for some pernicious examples of deepfake in election campaigns. Is there any time in an election campaign where AI-generated content is okay, do you think? Question for both of you.
Look, from my perspective, it's pretty hard to say because, again, that distinction between sort of truth in the policy argument, which is not my business, versus the electoral process, which is. And I know that Tom Rogers, I think last week before the JSCAN committee in Canberra, addressed this very issue. And for us, it's hard to say. We can certainly think of plenty of examples where it could be pernicious, where if you have someone who purports to be an electoral management body or a politician saying, hey, everyone, don't forget voting is now voluntary. You don't actually have to vote. That's the sort of thing that would obviously gravely concern me and my counterparts. Where it's used to then sell a political message or a policy platform, not my business directly. But the line in that case is not always clear. But as Tom made clear to the committee last week, as an electoral management body, the only lever we really have to pull is it properly authorised? And if it's properly authorised, that's sort of where our role ends. And I can understand that limitation because otherwise you'd have electoral bodies being in the policy fray, and that's not a place where we want to be.
Mm. Michael, is it okay? Are there circumstances where it's okay?
So this is a normative question. And I would say, generally speaking, if you're asking a question about the use of any technology or means of communication, the question for me in the context of the election is, does it help people connect their preferences with their vote choices, or does it hinder that process? And you could imagine an AI-generated image of a future newsreel under the condition of where the favored candidate won versus a member of the opposing party. And that, as long as it's properly designated as, this is what the headlines would look like in 1 year if you vote for me versus you vote for my opponent, and it's noted that this is artificially generated. Obviously, there's no way we can get a newspaper from the future, or certainly future potential scenarios or anything like that. That would be one thing, because then nobody really thinks that is the truth. But if it was somebody pretending to be a Sven or some other member of the Electoral Commission saying voting is voluntary, so if you're busy, don't worry. Have fun with your friends or family and don't bother to vote. Well, that would be a problem. If it was, there was a case where somebody faked the voice of Joe Biden during the primary, saying, this is a bunch of malarkey, this primary. You don't have to really vote in this. That's a way to manipulate people because they might actually think that's his actual voice. And so you can think of cases where the technology could be used creatively to do lots of things, including, generate ads that use content that's speculative or doesn't exist, in reality, generate artifacts that aren't real. But at the same time, that has to just be very clear what it is, that it's not a claim to actuality.
Okay, well, let's you did mention the word predictive there, and let's try and throw things forward a little. In your instance, Michael, how difficult an environment is this going to make the US election later this year, do you think?
It's hard to tell. AI isn't necessary to generate manipulative content, but I think there are two aspects to it that at least create the potential for far worse circumstances. The first is, a lot of times, especially earlier studies of like trolling and data and so forth on social media platforms, you could find some characteristic grammatical errors that aided in attributing certain texts to various different cultures or environments of origin. With AI, you avoid all of that, and particularly in a place like Australia or the United States, where the language is English, most of the training data sets for AIs are English language artifacts, and as a result, it would be pretty easy then for a foreign entity to generate lots of perfectly sounding English language messages. The other aspect of that is, so it's not only just the quality of the text and images and even video that are being generated dramatically improves, increasing their believability. The other aspect that changes is, even if you have millions of dollars to spend every month or even every week on these operations targeting only one country at a time, you still have a hard time overcoming the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that are spent across all the different media entities, campaigns, and then individuals organically producing content in a election space. But if you can have computers do that, if you can have AIs generate, say, 100,000 variations on a particular message, and they can then also monitor reactions to the messaging and calibrate to focus on flooding only the most effective messages, the ones that get the most retweets or the most shares or the most likes or whatever it is, then you've created a situation where it's easier for an adversary to gain information dominance in a particular space and produce effects than used to be the case. So I think both those factors tend to make it much more dangerous. Now, to what extent it might be deployed, we're not sure at this point, in part because I suspect that anybody is planning to use that kind of an attack in the upcoming U.S. election or any of the elections here regionally in Australia this year, probably is holding off right now and waiting till a more critical moment in which to, create in the American parlance an October surprise before the November election, when something will be more resident in people's minds when they go to the polls.
Yeah. Sven, you've got your council elections coming up later this year. Do you feel in this context that you have sufficient tools at your disposal for voters to feel that the integrity of the electoral system is absolutely 100%?
There I take us back to the issue of what's within our control in this regard. So how confident am I about the way we run the election, the way it's overseen, the way we have checks and balances, scrutineering, all of those sorts of things? Very, very comfortable. That will stand up to any level of scrutiny. I am 100% sure. Broadening that out now into this sort of mis and disinformation space, it's a little bit more complicated, or not complicated. It's a little bit different for local government elections, because while we are the regulator for certain types of misleading and deceptive conduct during a state election, such as information that incorrectly or that misleads someone into how they can or can't lodge a valid vote or how they complete a ballot paper. In the case of local government elections, that power rests with the local government inspectorate. We work very, very closely with them all the time, and particularly so in the lead up to local government elections. But what I pull from that question is a broader issue about, is the legislative environment that we've got in Victoria that governs elections, both state and local, is that fit for the times? Now, that is a question to answer simply because these laws were written before the widespread use of social media, let alone generative AI and similar developments. So for me, I would say that the call there is that we are continuously and rapidly heading into a new and different world in this space. And those pieces of legislation need a really, really good look. There, as I said, in terms of the integrity of running the election, counting the votes, all of those sorts of things, rock solid, no problem. it's the mis and disinformation around it that seeks to cast a shadow on that. That's where I think a lot more work needs to be done legislatively.
Okay, one more question from me before we get to our attendees' questions, and I suppose it's a short answer is perhaps the most helpful. We've talked about voters. What about journalists and media workers who are engaged in reporting and recording elections? What can they do to deliver, to find their way through this hedge of information and misinformation for each of you? Mike, what do you want to
have? Oh, yeah, please. Mike.
In terms of journalists, I mean, there's, first of all, part of the complications, and this is one of the issues I think that's Sven's raising with respect to the laws not necessarily having caught up with the time yet, is that the definition of a journalist has expanded greatly over time. So is it just somebody who works for example, the ABC or the Australian that's writing a story or going on the air to talk about something, or is it a blogger or a so-called citizen journalist with a high-profile social media account that provides, quote, breaking news updates or commentary on the news? And so those are all, raise some issues about those different roles. The other aspect about it is that the economics of news production have kind of tilted more in the direction of polarization in recent years than before. Although, Australia is known to have a somewhat polarized news environment, and they have been known for that for quite some time. And that creates some issues because as a journalist, you'd suspect in the purest form, it's all about putting information in context so that people can make informed decisions about issues in public life. But if you're a partisan, you may be less concerned about that. And if that partisan impulse infiltrates the editorial policy or the position of various news outlets, then that can be, highly problematic if people see themselves as loosely aligned as part of a ideological or partisan machinery, as opposed to completely independent of that. And so, I'd say, in an ideal sense, you'd want journalists to be focused more on helping people understand the facts in a particular situation, as opposed to playing that partisan role. But playing the partisan role is what tends to get more viewers and more clicks and shares. And that's part of the dilemma that we face today.
Sven?
Yeah. From my perspective, what I'd say is that, and this might be news to people on this call, because I think we're talking here primarily to bona fide journalists. But the importance of getting the facts right is just so crucial. Again, I don't need to tell this audience that. But in that regard, the VEC, we're always ready to be contacted to verify something that someone is investigating. If there's an issue about, some changes to the legislation, or how VEC is doing something, or what will happen in an upcoming election in terms of a particular aspect of the election or the legislative change that might have precipitated it, we're always ready to engage with the media about that. And we actually do that very, very quickly. We understand how crucial time is to a story like that. And so therefore, I just sort of invite all of you that if you are looking at doing a story that is in this space, I really invite you to come and contact us. Our media team is very responsive, very knowledgeable. They will get back to you, and we'll be able to give you the facts that you need. How you write your story, of course, is a matter for you. But we can certainly provide those facts. And the second point that I'd say, which to me is really, really important, is that we are unfortunately discovering through some research, I don't mean we VEC, I mean we as a society, are discovering that a lot of what we had thought would be effective responses to mis and disinformation are not that effective. The debunking, the fact correction, all of those sorts of things. Yes, we have to keep doing that, but a lot of it is not that effective. I think there was an MIT study that basically said that a false story travels something like 6 times as far as the truth, and is retweeted a lot more, all of those sorts of things. The one thing that I think can be effective, but is a very difficult thing to do, is just investing in an informed community and an informed electorate. And that's clearly where journalism has a really big role to play, because the more informed our community is, the less effective mis and disinformation will be. And it becomes a little bit more self-correcting. So I sort of always picture the discussion at a barbecue or at a pub where someone says something about, voting machines or something that's completely untrue. The best defense to that is someone else in that group saying, well, where'd you hear that? Is that really true? Or did you just pull that from some dodgy blog online and, written it might be, and you're telling it to us as fact? That's the best defense. And so therefore having that, I don't want to say educated, that's not the right word, but a sophisticated, critical and well-informed electorate and community. And that, I think, is where journalism has always played a big role, and I think hopefully will continue to do so.
Okay, well, let's go to some of our attendees' questions. One from Cara Waters, which I think is a really interesting one for you, Sven. She asks, do you expect to see much impact from people radicalised by COVID lockdowns in the local council elections? Those advocating against, particular issues, some of them may be part of the anti-vax movement. Is there likely to be issues around any of that from the VEC's perspective?
Look, from the VEC's perspective, it's really not an area we wade into, because a lot of that is about policy platforms, and therefore goes to the policy debate and candidates putting forward their policy platform and saying to the electorate, vote for me because you agree with my policies. That's not a fight that the VEC should be a part of. If the radicalisation that's mentioned in the question leads to mis and disinformation about how to vote, like I said earlier, in other words, you can't vote if you're unvaccinated or anything like that, any misinformation like that, then we would be very interested. In fact, there are provisions under the legislation to prevent or to guard against that. We would be interested in that. But in terms of issues like 15-minute cities and so on, it's not an issue for us. I mean, there is a bigger debate in Australia about truth in political advertising laws, and that would be an example, or could potentially be an example of that. But I've certainly made it clear that that would be a matter for Parliament as to whether there should be truth in political advertising laws. And if the answer to that question were yes, and there is no answer to that yet, but if it were yes, then I would say that a body like the VEC would not be the right place to administer such a thing, because we've got to maintain our independence in running the election, and we can't be in that sort of political space.
So you've actually preempted one of the other questions, which will probably come as no surprise to you, and that is about truth in advertising. The premise of the question is that regulating truth in advertising is often an issue blurred with disinformation. Now, happy for you to tackle the premise of that. But the question then goes on, could you each distinguish between these two influences and offer an opinion on the role of fact-checking in democratic landscape?
Yeah, well, as we've seen in public debate in Australia, those are not straightforward questions. The issue of truth in political advertising is a really important policy debate to be had. And I don't think it would be appropriate for the VEC to put a position on whether we should have such laws. I simply don't think so. But I have a very strong view that if we did have it, then we should not be the arbiter of that. On the other question of distinguishing between mis and disinformation, and we then get into some really, really difficult spaces. I mean, you can certainly have misleading information that isn't necessarily deliberate disinformation, which gets back to my opening point of mis and disinformation can both be very pernicious. And the other thing I'd just say in that space is that mis and disinformation is not limited to the online environment either. It's just that the online environment is so infinitely scalable at very little cost that it can move like wildfire. But I think there's always been mis and disinformation around elections and policy debates since there's been politics.
Michael, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I would say the misinformation, disinformation, fake news issues, I think have been around as long as we've had any form of news reporting. There was, in the early days of the American Republic, Richard Fenno, who was an editor of a newspaper aligned with the Federalist Party, was criticizing the vile fountains that have been polluting the public space of the newspapers and the opposition. 1925, so almost 100 years ago, Harper's Bazaar used the term fake news to describe what was called otherwise at that time yellow journalism. These issues aren't limited to the online space, so they've been around for a long time. I'd also agree with Sven about in terms of the truth in advertising or political advertising, it certainly shouldn't be something that's left up to an electoral commission to police if it gets adopted at all, because in order to maintain the integrity of our elections, they need a very limited remit that's as far away from any form of politicization as possible. And being an umpire on what constitutes truth, that's a very dangerous space for any government body to get into, which makes me a little bit nervous when it comes to adopting such laws. Because you can imagine a case in which something gets ruled false, but the party that's known for putting out that position wins office. What happens to that government commission then that's calling balls and strikes on the truth or falsity of statements in the public sphere about politics? That's a very awkward and uncomfortable situation to be in. And it can weaponize parts of the government against each other. So I think that's something that we should approach somewhat cautiously. I'm greatly concerned about the presence of misleading as well as deceptive and false information in the public space. But again, there's also then questions that a truth in advertising body would run into, whereby there may be, if you parse things in just the right way, a claim that there is a certain truth, or at least a truth from a particular perspective, something that would not be, they wouldn't be in a position to, for example, litigate in order to produce some sort of a fine or sanction against an offending party or individual candidate. And so a lot of damage can be done at the margins. And in fact, in some ways, it becomes even more believable at that point in time, because you can point to, well, here's the fact of this, here's the fact of this. And as a reactive body, those kind of reactive fact-checking, debunking efforts often are too little too late. As Sven was pointing out, the MIT study, I think it was run by Sinan Aral and some of his colleagues there, lies make it a lot faster because a lie is not constrained by reality. It can tell an appealing story. Reality is often messy and lacks that internal, persuasion. And so as a result, that kind of applying sanctions or those reactive measures often are not nearly as effective as campaigns recognizing there's a change to our campaign and public environment. They need to preempt things and be actively engaged and flood the space with true information to make it harder for some other campaign using deceptive or false or misleading content to create an errant belief in the public, to manipulate people. So it's those kind of inoculation processes that might be more effective. And that might be something that's best left to the campaigns, so you don't run the risk of some aspect of the government being politicized or weaponized against either the opposition or the party that wins power.
Yeah. So it's perhaps appropriate that our final question is actually about journalism, but it's also about the subtext to everything we've talked about today, and that's about faith in institutions and trust in institutions. So Emily has raised this question: how can we begin to fight misinformation and disinformation when journalism itself is perceived by many people to have a trust and credibility issue all of its own? So how is that challenge navigated? One for each of you before we wrap up.
Yeah, okay, look, that's a really, really good question. And I mean, if we're talking about journalism as a profession, and not a profession of which I can ever claim to have been a member, so I speak as an outsider, but it does highlight that there is a really important role in a sophisticated, successful society for a professional journalism approach. And the problem is, of course, is that journalism itself is under so much threat, not least of which through changes to the revenue source that of course used to exist, and that's now completely unrecognizable to what it was 20, 30 years ago. And then, of course, it's much harder to avoid in this way the issue that Michael mentioned, is that these billion-dollar algorithms that we're up against here, they are self-serving by design. They are there to create attention, to reward attention, not to reward truth and integrity or the benefit of society. They are there to monetize attention. And that, I think, is just something we just need to keep pointing out again and again through journalists, through lay people, through general discussion, to say, if we do that successfully, then people will realize that, yes, they're a part of society, but they are not to be treated in the same way as professional journalism. And professional journalism has a value all of its own that is an incredibly important part of what we're talking about here. What the solution is to that beyond here, I'm probably not well placed to answer, but I certainly agree with the sentiment.
Michael, just briefly, please.
Yeah, I likewise am speaking as an outsider. I think certainly being transparent about sources to the greatest extent possible. Obviously, journalists can't always name their sources, otherwise they might not get access. But to the extent they can, to focus on reducing the complexity of issues, because I think a lot of people get lost in the bewildering complexity of society today. That if they have short explainers saying this is why this matters, that's often helpful. And to be clear on the different partisan angles that's not part of their job in terms of reporting the news. Okay. There isn't a partisan story.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank Sven and Michael for being part of this. Terrific contribution. Really enjoyed the chat. Thank you to you both. Our final webinar in the series has moved to next Tuesday, not next Wednesday, and we'll be looking at regulation and different approaches to tackling misinformation and disinformation with a panel moderated by the ABC's national technology reporter, Angela Lavoie-Pierre. So join us at 1 p.m. on Tuesday. Thanks again, Sven. Thanks again, Michael, and thanks to all of you who attended our webinar today. So good afternoon, and thanks for being part of the Melbourne Press Club's webinar series.